shouldn't everyone be equal and be taken care of? And the way we're going to do it is essentially state-run grocery stores to keep prices low and a baby basket for every kid. And wouldn't it be nice if public transportation was free? But at the root of these ideas are violence. At the root of these ideas are class warfare, and at the root of these ideas is a construct that tells people, you know what? There's always an oppressor or an oppressed, and you're on the side of the oppressed, and that means we ought to tear down the institutions of our society. Today, what the big disjunct is with the younger generation of people who don't really fully understand the crimes of communism, what a terrible ideology it is, the wreckage that is a part of every single country that fall under some form of Marxism.
Welcome to the Viktor Frankl podcast. My name is Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch. I'm here with my co-host, attorney Lori Fein. We have with us a very special guest today, Dr. Eric Patterson, who is the president and CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington. Dr. Patterson, welcome to the show.
Eric Daniel, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's wonderful to see you. Now, we know about the horrors of fascism. Everybody knows about Nazism and the Holocaust, where maybe 20 to 30 million people were murdered by the Germans and other forces during World War II. We know little about communism in the United States. It's estimated that maybe 60 to 100 million people were murdered under communist regimes over the 20th century. And today it says that over 1.6 billion people, 1 in 5 people still live under communism. Could you tell us why people know about Nazism but know very little about the dangers of communism?
You know, we've done a very good job of documenting the horrors of the Holocaust and the horrors of Nazism. By the way, we still have work to do. So it's a reminder to us that there's a vigilance that we have to have when it comes to anti-Semitism and all forms of totalitarianism. But at the end of World War II, we beat the bad guys. We captured it on film. It kind of helps that they were so colorful and macabre and that they documented their atrocities. And then we have done a good job in the West of teaching each generation that the face of Adolf Hitler is odious, that the word Nazi is odious, that the idea of Aryan supremacy in a totalitarian state, murdering its own citizens, that these things are odious. When it comes to communism, though, at the end of the Cold War, we managed, I think quite successfully, the fall of Eastern Europe without a lot of gloating in order to try to bring Eastern European countries into a new security architecture to manage the fall of the Soviet Union and whatnot. But what we didn't do was to document well for the public the historical atrocities of communism. And today, as you said, more than 1.5 billion people live in places like China, North Korea, Cuba, and other places that are still ravaged by this terrible ideology.
Yeah, I don't think people understand how evil communism is, how destructive it is, and that it still manifests itself in various forms today in politics, even here in the United States. Last night, there was a debate for the mayor of New York City, a fellow named Zohran Mamdani, who calls himself a democratic socialist. He wants to defund the police, seize the means of production, have government-run grocery stores, freeze rent, and as we all know, he refuses to announce the term globalize the intifada. You recently wrote an article last month called Why 62% of Young Americans Are Falling for Pop Marxism. Could you tell us, what did you mean in that article? What is pop Marxism, and why is Mamdani so dangerous?
So the reason I call it pop Marxism is that many, many young adults and teens are seduced by something that's faddish, it's intellectually light, it tickles the ears. And so the type of platform of the candidate you're speaking about says, hey, shouldn't everyone be equal and be taken care of? And the way we're going to do it is essentially state-run grocery stores to keep prices low and a baby basket for every kid. And wouldn't it be nice if public transportation was free? But at the root of these ideas are violence. At the root of these ideas are class warfare, And at the root of these ideas is a construct that tells people, you know what, there's always an oppressor or an oppressed, and you're on the side of the oppressed. And that means we ought to tear down the institutions of our society.
So I want to talk about a real phenomenon that happened between 1966 and 1976, the Cultural Revolution in China under Mao Zedong. He instituted these policies to really radically change Chinese society. Millions of students attacked what he called the Four Olds, which were persecuting teachers, officials, even families with violence and humiliation. It's estimated up to 8 million people were killed during the Cultural Revolution. I wanted to note also that at the end of the revolution, the Communist, the CCP party condemned it, saying it was a disaster. From what you see with these new policies being touted, it's not just Mamdani, it's people around the country. It's in Minnesota, it's in San Francisco. We're very concerned that perhaps these trends will take off now, especially New York City, which is the seat of capitalism and freedom in the West, being taken over by a socialist, democratic socialist slash communist. Um, where do you see this taking us in society? Are we going into a cultural revolution in the United States right now?
So the Cultural Revolution was so destructive because what it targeted was what it called any form of old thinking. But that what that meant was is that centers of authority and wisdom were attacked and destroyed. So that meant attack your parents, attack your grandparents, call into question the educational establishment. So they essentially destroyed the education system in China and attack private business, meaning just the merchant down the street, your uncle, his family business. Attack any of those things that were levels of authority other than the Communist Party. And so anytime that you see someone say, we're going to rip down the forms of authority, we're going to rewrite history and just trust us because once we burn it down, trust us, we're well meaning, we're going to do something that's going to be more just and more equitable down the road. And that's precisely the types of things that we see when it says, well, we're going to defund the police, or you can just trust us. If you give us all this power, we'll run City Hall in a way that's going to be more equitable or things. Or listen, we're going to rewrite the history books and take out the great story of American freedom and free markets. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to replace it with a new ideology. Anytime you see that, we're on a very dangerous trajectory.
Yeah. You know, there's an example in Kansas City of the Sunfresh Market that was, I think, closed this past summer. It was also a government-run supermarket that just failed. Could you talk about, let's play a thought experiment for a moment. Mamdani wins, which looks like he may, unfortunately, and he's never run a business in his life. He's never run a company. He's never managed people in an organization. He's going to be mayor of a multi-billion dollar corporation called New York City. He's going to be running in 5 boroughs, government-run supermarkets. What does it look like? What does New York City look like if this type of fantasies take place? It's not just that, it's freezing the rent, it's seizing the means of production, a Marxist term. What happens to a city like New York? What happens to America in a few years under these policies?
Well, what one would hope is that the natural checks and balances of, for instance, the state government and private business and the federal government would, in our system, counteract those types of things. But let's play it out in a worst case scenario. In the worst case scenario, what ends up every time that we see one of these imposed statist types of regimes take over is that innovation stops first, business leaves, and so the government, the state it, what it does it chooses winners and it chooses losers. It develops kind of a crony sense of economics because the way that it sees the economic pie, if you will, is that there's just a single pie. And so it's up to the government to choose the winners and losers and distribute the pieces of the one pie. The way a free market system works is we're constantly looking for more bakers, more chefs to bake more pies. That's how you get the Steve Jobs, the Benjamin Franklins, the Elon Musk, the Jonas Salk. In other words, all of the creative energy of life happens when you have a market where the government is not choosing its crony friends as winners and losers.
I think a lot of young people today would argue that the form of capitalism that we have today already has cronyism and friendship as a basis of winners and losers. I mean, you can see examples across our society that are frequently brought up. Let's say, capitalists hire their friends. They lobby the government and get government subsidies for things for their companies. We see that there is significant corruption even in our capitalist market. We see huge accumulation of wealth that, in theory, capitalism allows wealth to be well distributed across society because innovators can come and reap some of that wealth and create new wealth. But what we've seen is, I think, the generation that's coming of age now has a great deal of difficulty replicating a life that is at least as good as and comfortable as their parents. And when I speak to young people, I speak at a lot of college campuses and with my children and their friends, and we see that a lot of them are very discouraged. How do you feel? Do you feel that that's a result of a realistic assessment of what's going on in society? Do you feel like they have been influenced by propaganda and miseducation? Or do you think that perhaps there are changes that need to be made in the way that we are approaching the capitalist society that we prefer?
But a lot of young people do recognize that, for instance, in this New York case that we're talking about, that prices are high. Prices are very high in New York City. But they have an inaccurate view of what causes that and what their choices are in a free market. So in the New York case, Mondani's platform talks a lot about high prices and that government is the solution to making your life easier by a bunch of freebies. And it doesn't talk about the costs that a free society has if it wants to have sidewalks or libraries or medical care or insurance. And it doesn't talk about the personal responsibility that individual citizens have to supporting the services that they want. So many young people that I meet actually have absolutely no sense at all about what it takes to provide those types of services. Moreover, living in New York City or in any city is not necessarily a fundamental human right. One of the choices that people have is to move to places where costs are lower. That's not a part of this campaign. That's not what people are talking about. But seeking opportunity in places that are lower cost, all of those things are a part of a bigger mix that we need to be talking about when we're talking to young people about what do we really mean by costs are high? What are your choices? How does your education parlay into a job? What is the relationship between you and the citizen, your freedoms, and government power?
I'm a strong free market capitalist, but I do hear what students are saying, and I think that there's somewhat of a fantasy that candidates like Mamdani are selling, which is that somehow either the existing wealth in society and resources or the wealth that's been gathered to the rich people would be sufficient to pay for everybody to have everything that they want. And we all know that the reality is not that way. I think it's very interesting because I think students today don't learn anything, very little, about really the level of life that citizens or that people in Soviet Union, in China, and in other communist societies are living at such a different lifestyle than we live here. And this idea of free supermarkets, I mean, it would be nice if your groceries are free, but are you going to be able to get the cuts of meat that you'd like? Or, the fancy condiments that many students have become accustomed to.
Yeah, starting much earlier with opportunities to talk about cost and worth and value and how those things work and the opportunities to do work. I think that one of the big disjunctures that we're talking about is how many students have actually had a job at a fairly young age, how many of them have worked versus doing all, say, enrichment activities after school or during their summers. But
Well,
what I
that's a
try
very
to
interesting. That's an interesting thought. Can you tell me a little bit more about your views on that?
Yeah, sure. So I've been around college students for most of the past 3 decades. I have interns that come through my program here. I teach on college campuses and speak. And what I find is that many of our younger adults have actually had very little real work where they've had to make money, have a budget, make choices about things. The vast majority that I see by the time that they're graduating from college have had very little real work experience. Now, they may have done some very creative things. They may have had some internships where they worked very hard. But the part of it, which is the monetized aspect of it, paying their own bills, having to make a choice between A and B, having to go grocery shopping and not be able to afford the $8 Starbucks, but just having to make sure that they have a budget just to meet their basic meals needs during the week. Those types of maturing processes, which are fundamental to the way a free society works. We want voting citizens who've had to make these types of choices over a period of time. Many, many, many of our young adults have not done that. And so I think a part of the mix, part of the conversation is when we're talking about the free market, where does innovation come from? How do people make choices about savings? How do they make choices about charitable giving? And starting with those types of conversations about the choices that we want citizens to be able to make and not leave all that stuff in the hands of government.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a term which says good times create weak people create bad times create strong people, and strong people create great times. Is it possible the generation you're talking about, the American college student today, maybe people in their later 20s today, grew up as children of our Generation X, that they are just beneficiaries of tremendous amount of capitalism and success, and they've been given so much today. And so they're doing what the opposite of what you're saying. Instead of taking personal responsibility, they're demanding more, and they're turning from their parents to the state to do the same thing.
Well, part of it is that. So there's a level of wealth and affluence that many of our young people don't really realize that they have. And compared by historical standards or world standards, think about what the life is like for someone in West Africa or in Southeast Asia or in Southwest Asia or in Latin America. I mean, our young people have a tremendous amount of wealth. But here's the other part of the challenge, and that is that for the past 20 years or so in our schools, instead of teaching the great story of America, of freedom overcoming generation after generation, of greater opportunity, of overcoming our old evils of slavery, of the move in the right direction for the past 250 years. Instead of that story being taught, most of our young people have been taught instead a neo-Marxist type of view that American history is always about oppressor and oppressed. And it's usually white, male, Christian types who are oppressing everybody else. And so the blessings of this time are not the hard work of the greatest generation and others. The blessings of this time have actually been stolen. They've been stolen by people of color. They've been stolen from women. They've been stolen from religious minorities. And you ought to feel guilty about that and put yourself on the side of the oppressed and tear down the institutions of our society today. That's a very dangerous approach, but that oppressor versus oppressed critical lens has been in our universities and our high schools and even our K-8 education for the past 20 years.
I think that it's certainly not only is the oppressor oppressed, I agree with you, but dangerous for our society, but it's dangerous on an individual level as well, I think, because individuals who feel themselves to be victim are much less likely to be satisfied in life, happy in life, productive in life. They're less likely to seek out opportunities because they believe that they've already had it predetermined that the opportunities will not work out for them. I'm actually shocked sometimes when you meet students who are at elite Ivy League universities and they will complain about the oppression or about their lack of having this or that specific opportunity. That it's possible that there are a couple things that are closed to them, but I would have thought a generation ago, knowing that you're at one of these elite institutions was an opportunity to write your ticket in life. And now I think a lot of people don't even see it that way, even those who are at the top of the educational food chain, let alone people below.
And so if you get into a political competition like the one that you're seeing in New York right now, and you have a candidate who implicit in every part of the platform is there's someone who's taking things from you. If you go through the platform, there's always someone who is robbing you. It is landlords and people who own buildings, property owners. They're taking advantage of you. It is grocery store owners. Somehow they're taking advantage of you. The current level of government services, somehow it's taking advantage of you. So you ought to have free transportation. You're being taken advantage by law enforcement. So we ought to defund the police or restrict them even more. And by the way, we're going to create an army of social servants, these community organizer types, and they're going to go into the shopping malls, they're going to go to the street corners, and they're going to look at ways that the government can better serve you. Well, so that entire mix is predicated on you're oppressed and trust us to liberate you.
Yeah. What is the difference, and this is important for our listeners to understand, between socialism and
Mhm.
communism? When they use the term democratic socialist of America, what does that mean exactly? What does that turn into eventually?
Well, I have to say that there's been clever marketing to say that, well, socialism is just about equality, and we can vote for that. It has no problems with being democratic. And they'll often look to Northern European countries which are very democratic, and by the way, quite open to the free market, but do provide a much higher level of social services. Sometimes those countries are called democratic socialists. But the truth of the matter is they're both democratic and they have vibrant businesses, vibrant economies, and lots of individual freedoms. They're not socialist countries. They've made a different social contract, for instance, when it comes to healthcare and things, but they're not socialist. True socialism is this. Karl Marx said, Lenin agreed, socialism is the first step of two towards communism. And socialism is where government takes control of the entire economic sector of life. And if you think about what that means, all things economic, it's not just a few private businesses or trying to right a few inequalities. That means government deciding about inheritance, government deciding on the price of food, government making decisions about where your kids can go to school or where they can go to college. Any of those things that have an economic part of them, true socialism wants to take control of. And if you look at the type of platform from candidates who call themselves democratic socialists, they want to control all aspects of economic life.
Who are the Democratic Socialists of America? Do you know who's behind them? Without naming names, but who are the people who's supporting this?
Yeah, so there are some wealthy benefactors to this, people who are sold out, frankly, to an ideology of a much greater state and to an ideology that does not trust individual initiative, doesn't trust free market competition, and the like. The kinds of candidates that we see are often fairly young, very, very little experience either in government or in the private sector. And they're willing to admit often that their programs, such as the Green New Deal, the kind of the ultimate socialist project of the past decade, that'll cost far, far more than that it will ever provide in terms of jobs or funds, but that it's worth it because the new social agenda driven by government bureaucrats is worth it for everybody else. And that's the thing to look at. People who say, trust us, our social agenda is so empowering and it's so liberating that if you just trust us, give us the power, allow us to print money, allow us to control the economic side of life, we'll lead you to a magical utopia.
And that magical utopia looks like Venezuela, I'm assuming, because that they took one of the wealthiest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Within 20, 30 years, they've run it to the ground. Hyperinflation,
Mhm.
less products on the shelves, lack of freedom. Political parties are made illegal in the country. A woman, just Machado, I believe her name is, she just won the Nobel Peace Prize for standing up against the government of Venezuela. Do people understand from your perspective that is what the Democratic Socialists of America want to turn this country into?
I'm glad you brought up Venezuela because it is the best case study right now. This is a country that was as rich as France in the 1960s and 70s. It was the second most wealthy country and then the most wealthy country in Latin America. It was a democratic country that functioned quite well. And this is a country that a socialist leader could not win an election. So he tried a coup. They made a mistake. They let him out of prison after just a few months. He tried a coup again. He ultimately did come later win an election, and then his party has installed itself in every part of civic life over the past 30 years. Just 18 months ago, Venezuela had an election, and it's an election that uses the same types of machines we have, and there's a printed chit or receipt that you receive when you walk out. We know from the paper that two-thirds of Venezuelans voted against the regime, but the regime maintained itself in power by brute force. Maria Corina Machado, who just won the Nobel Prize last Friday, is a great champion for freedom for her country, but she's had to live in hiding because she's persona non grata in Venezuela. So it's a destructive model.
I just watched Barry Weiss interview her after she won the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know if you saw that interview. It was remarkable. And what she said was she's just a very common person. She had no political background. She never thought she would win, but she won resoundingly in the election. Is that for you a model of a personality type that we need more of, people that are really willing to speak out from your perspective?
We need a lot more people like her. The good news is that throughout American history, we've had these remarkable individuals who you wouldn't have known they were remarkable when they were young. People who turn into the George Washingtons, the Harriet Trumans, the Ronald Reagans of our country. And I have a lot of confidence that there are many, many, many of those people out there today. She's a remarkable case. But what we need is we need candidates who are going to explain that government does not provide all the solutions for our society. And they're going to get us back to our fundamental principles of individual rights and responsibilities as the basis for a free society.
It sounds,
Absolutely.
yeah, go ahead.
The individual is the focus of Western culture. It's the focus of the Bible. The power of the individual and the necessity of each individual to find their purpose in life is part of what Viktor Frankl's, since we're on the Viktor Frankl podcast, that was his ideology. It is certainly deeply rooted in Jewish and Christian theology. And I think that, I think one of the things I see with young people who I speak with frequently is that their combination of their fear and their, perhaps you could say, laziness, they would rather rely on someone else to give them something than to try to make their own way, because it is scary and it is risky, and we've created a very risk averse generation. That's been borne out in many, many studies, that this is one of the most risk averse generations ever in history. And I think that one of the lessons that I try to teach is that no one is giving you more than they're giving themselves. And if you're going to rely on the government, the people in government are going to take a lot more for themselves than they're ever going to be able to distribute to you. And so you're better off making your own way.
I think that's very well said, and that's at the root of the types of citizens that we want to have. I do think that there's parts of the country perhaps that do this better than others, based in part upon regional culture. I think it probably happens better outside of the cities, where there's more self-reliance in smaller communities. But a focus on the individual, and second, a focus on how important the family is. The family being the fundamental construct in the Bible, in our society, in Western civilization, for people to have human flourishing. And then that third element, that we really have a permissive culture in the good sense, that there's still tremendous opportunities for people to contribute. And I think, we're about to enter the period of Thanksgiving, when we think a lot about gratitude and about contributions, the contributions, for instance, that our veterans have made to the country. Veterans Day is right before Thanksgiving. That always strikes me as fortuitous. These are the types of lessons that we want to be inculcating with those young people. How did we get to this point in our society in America? Well, it's the hard work of individuals and things, and we have a lot to be thankful for. And that gratitude should be motivating us towards service, not kind of deconstructive criticism.
Yes. And can you tell us more about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, what you do, the information that you offer, the educational programs, and how people could connect with your organization?
I'd love to. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation was founded by a unanimous act of Congress in 1993 and signed into law by Bill Clinton. But it's an entirely nonprofit, non-governmental educational association based in Washington, D.C. We really do three things in order to commemorate the victims of the past and to advocate for the liberty of people today. We have a whole set of education programs, so professors training, teachers trainings, a high school, middle school, and other curricular pieces, all the way down to elementary school, to emphasize both not just the horrors of communism and the historical facts, but also the heroes, the people who stood up, and the ways to overcome it. The second thing we do is we have a set of policy teams that work on contemporary issues. For instance, we have the leading team focused on China and the Uyghur genocide and the things that are going on in China today. We published a report last fall that resulted in Volkswagen and another European country pulling out of factories that were using slave labor in Xinjiang province in China. So that type of work, educating policymakers, the media, the public on the crimes of communism today is right at the center of our mission. And then the third thing we do is 3 years ago, we opened the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, D.C. It's 2 blocks from the White House at McPherson Square. And so we'd love to host your group or when you come to town to visit the museum on Tuesdays through Saturdays every week of the year.
And it's interesting to note that it was signed into Congress through Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat.
Yeah.
We know the great work of Ronald Reagan, but it's a nonpartisan organization, clearly, because both sides of the aisle supported the creation of your foundation.
That's right. In 1993 and 1994, it was so apparent how raw the wounds of communism were because the Cold War was just ending in 89, 90, 91. And China had reasserted itself at home with the Tiananmen Square massacre of June 4th, 1989. So the fight against communism in all of its forms was very much a bipartisan issue in the 1980s and the 1990s. I would say that today, what the big disjunct is with the younger generation of people who don't really fully understand the crimes of communism, what a terrible ideology it is, the wreckage that is a part of every single country that fall under some form of Marxism.
And it's quite remarkable to me. I recently watched the movie Reagan, the Ronald Reagan film with Dennis Quaid. And it was fascinating because he was studying the dangers of communism since he was a little child. He was fascinated by him. He was studying for that moment in life where he's able to stand up and say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. How has that influenced your personal choices leading this organization right now? What's your personal message for America right now?
Well, Reagan was very inspirational to me. I grew up in a family that was a working family. Most of my dad's generation didn't have anything beyond a high school degree. He did well as a businessman, but it was all things that he had done himself. Church was at the center of life for our family. And so when President Reagan came on giving a speech, as I was a child growing up, my parents always said, listen to the president. We're going to sit down. We're going to listen to what he has to say. What he has to say about America is right. What he has to say about the world and communism is accurate. So I was very inspired by those realities that President Reagan, the way that he was able to distinguish the importance of the individual and the family and the American way of life and America's great contributions, the emphasis on human rights, for instance, that America has brought to the globe, and the way that he distinguished the fight against the evil ideology and practices of communism from the people who are held captive by those regimes. He was constantly reaching his hand out to the people behind the Iron Curtain. He was an advocate for them just as much as he was an advocate for Americans. And I think that that's a lesson for us today. We have a role to play to be vigilant against tyranny in any of its forms. It's not because we hate the Chinese people. We love the Chinese people, but we realize that they're surveilled, they're controlled, and in many cases, they're used as co-opted labor. They're thrown into prisons. They're blood typed so that their organs can be harvested. We want to be champions of the Chinese people against the Communist Party. We want to be champions of the North Korean people. And right here at home, there's a role to play for us to be a champion for future generations that they don't fall into the trap of the lies of today's socialists and communists.
Yeah,
Well, I
I
hope that
definitely,
your efforts bear tremendous fruit, and the educational efforts that you're making are so important. I think that many colleges, many elementary and lower, really need to learn those lessons. And I'm so excited that you have this opportunity to be here with us and teach us about how that might get done. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.